What's up, family? Hey, just wanted to let you guys know I made it back to the backyard again. A little bit overcast today, but we'll still get this video in. I wanted to do a part 3 for the ABG talk that we've been doing over the past couple of weeks. But the next part to this series is actually breaking down and interpreting some blood gases. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to dive right into that and jump into a little interpretation tool or an algorithm that I've used in the past to help teach different disciplines and different levels of practitioner understand how to interpret blood gases. So what we've got here is we've got the cheat sheet coming, right? Or the quick reference guide. So here is a look at the quick reference guide. I'm going to do my best to make sure that you guys can see this. But throughout this, what we're going to do is we're going to ask 4 questions, right? The 4 questions are, what is my pH? Is it alkalotic or acidotic? What is my CO2? Is my CO2 causing the acidosis? Is my CO2 causing the alkalosis? Yes, no. I'm going to go back and look at the pH. Is my pH within normal ranges? And then I'll look at all 3, the pH, the CO2, and the bicarb to see if that patient is partially compensated or working towards compensating their issue at that time. To get reps in, we're going to have to do some practice, right? So in order to practice, we've got to see some blood gases. So these are all blood gases that I've either created without the Henderson-Hasselbalch formula, so don't crucify me for that. But there are also patients that I've actually, or blood gases that I've collected from patients. But our first patient here has a pH of 7.22, a CO2 of 37, and a bicarb of 16, right? So 722, 37, 16. And what we want to do is we want to start with that first question. What is my pH? Well, my pH, is it acidotic or alkalotic? If we go back to our first video, I talked about anything that's above 740 is alkalotic and anything below 740 is acidotic. So is 722 below 740? Absolutely. So we have an acidotic patient right here. So we have the acidotic side. Then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the CO2. Is the CO2 causing the acidosis? Again, referring back to the first video, if the CO2 is greater than 40, most likely it is causing that acidosis. In this case, we have a CO2 of 37. CO2 of 37. So that is not a respiratory problem. Okay, if it's not respiratory, it's got to be metabolic. So right away, I know that I have a metabolic acidosis. Next, I go back to my pH. Is my pH within the normal range? No, it's outside of the acceptable or normal ranges, outside of that 7.35. It's at 7.22, right? 7.22. So I know that this is not a compensated. So working through the algorithm here, the first question, what is the pH? We know that it's acidotic. Sorry, that's my homework being graded at that point. My pH is acidotic. My CO2 is not causing it, so it's a metabolic problem. And then I go to my pH. Is my pH within normal? If it was, it would be compensated. And the last question that I ask is, are all 3 within acceptable ranges? And all 3 are outside of that acceptable range, 7.22, 37, and 16, all outside of acceptable ranges, all outside of normal. So in that case, we have an uncompensated metabolic acidosis. Is that what you got? That's what I got. Next one, let's do this again. pH is 7.35, CO2 is 50, and the bicarb is 37. Okay, 7.53, excuse me, 7.53. pH is 7.53, CO2 is 50, and the bicarb is 37. So we're going to look at the pH first. Is my pH acidotic or alkalotic? Alkalotic in this case. The next thing I'm going to look is my CO2 causing the alkalosis? And in this case, no, it's not, right? It's not a CO2 causing that pH to be elevated. It's the bicarb. So I know that I have a metabolic alkalosis thus far. That's what I know so far. Then I go back to the pH. Is my pH within that acceptable range? If my pH is within the acceptable range, it's not within that 735 to 745. It's 753. So no, it's not compensated. And then I'll go look at all three values. Are all three values abnormal? 7.35, CO2 of 50, and a bicarb of 37. Yes, all three of those are abnormal. So in this particular blood gas, I have a partially compensated metabolic alkalosis. And if you remember from part 2, we talked about how to treat these different interpretations. With metabolic alkalosis, 9 times out of 10, we're going to use fluids to try to hydrate these patients because their electrolytes are in havoc. So again, we're going to use saline if that's what the patient needs, or we'll use some potassium if they're hypokalemic as well. Next problem here, 7.22, CO2 of 71, and a bicarb of 25. Okay, so with this case, I have pH is 7.22. That's on the low side, so I have an acidotic pH. Then I'm going to look at the CO2. Is my CO2 causing that pH to be low? In this case, yes, I have a respiratory acidosis. Then I go back to my pH. Is my pH within the acceptable range? No, it's not. Okay, so it's not compensated. If your pH is not within the acceptable range, it is not compensated. So let's say that the other way. If my pH is within an acceptable range, I do have a compensated blood gas. Lastly, looking at the bicarb, or looking at all three, 7.22, 71, and 25, not all of these are out of range. The bicarb is within the acceptable range at 25. So in this case, I have an uncompensated respiratory acidosis. That's what the answer key tells me. All right, I think I have just 2 more blood gases before we finish up here. All right, here we go. pH is 7.39, CO2 of 99, and a bicarb of 58.4. Okay, pH is on the acidotic side, 7.39. It's just below 7.40. Okay, so I'm on the acidotic side. My CO2 is 99. My CO2 is causing that pH to be just on the low side of normal. Sorry, getting a little bit of a glare there. Okay, pH is 7.39, CO2 is 99, bicarb of 58.4. So we know that we have a respiratory acidosis. I go back to my pH. I look to see if that's within the acceptable range. It is at 7.39. That's within the acceptable range. So I know that I have a compensated respiratory acidosis. And this was actually a patient that I took care of back many, many moons ago. They were on a Venturi mask talking to me. They were fairly obese, so they weren't walking, but they were talking and they were able to answer questions for me. But other than needing some oxygen, they were doing just fine. So you have to understand that patient's CO2 of 99, their CO2 of 99 is probably close to their normal. You put yourself and myself in a CO2 of 99, I'm going to be 99. I'll be asleep. So just know that you have to recognize what your patient's normal is as well. Last interpretation here: 7.40, 40, and 24. This one's easy. We've got a normal blood gas. Okay? Don't go around looking for zebras when you have a field full of horses. Okay? Don't look for those exotic diagnoses. Don't look for those exotic, complex interpretations when we have a simple one right in front of us. If you would like to ask me what life is like in the Virgin Islands, if you have additional content that you want me to try to make simple for you, I'm happy to do so. So be sure you like, subscribe, and send me a bunch of comments. I love doing this stuff, so send me a ton of comments so that I know, so that I have more things to talk about with you guys. So I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you enjoyed the view. I'll talk to you guys soon.